Hello, I'm Robert Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico, and I'm going to be talking to you about weird New Mexico history. I'm going to be looking over here at my computer at the PowerPoint that you should be able to see on your screen, okay? So don't get distracted, just think of it as a little weird. Here we go. Why weird history? I'm going to tell you why. I love history. I love New Mexico history. I love traditional history. I love economic history, social history, religious history. But I also like the strange stories, the weird stories, the things that kind of sound fantastic and unreal, yet they are real. They're stranger than fiction. They're true. So that's why I'm going to be talking to you about weird New Mexico history. Here we go. The man who lost his head. Look at that image. That's Lon Chaney as the Phantom of the Opera. I love these paintings you're going to see throughout this presentation. They're by one of my favorite artists, Basil Gogos. And I want to talk to you about this because the man who lost his head is a very common theme in New Mexico history. Beheadings. A beheading was one of the most common forms of execution during the Spanish colonial period and into the Mexican period. In the late 1500s, when Juan de Oñate colonized New Mexico, there were people who didn't want to stay here and they left, and that was a crime, a desertion. They deserted the colony. So Captain Gaspar de Villagra was sent by Oñate to hunt these deserters down and execute them by beheading them. Villagra did this. He found them in the desert, cut their heads off, and then, ironically, he headed south and deserted. He left and disappeared for a while. Good thing is he ended up publishing an epic poem about New Mexico in 1610 in Spain. Look at that, 1641, the governor of New Mexico, Luis de Rosas, he was executed and killed, assassinated by some New Mexicans. There were about 5 men involved in that, and the so-called leader was Antonio Baca, and another was Francisco Salazar. These men were beheaded for killing the governor. And then look at this into our Mexican period. 1837, Governor Albino Perez, Mexican governor of New Mexico. There was a revolt at Taos, and the people there killed him and cut his head off. The story goes they kicked his head around like a soccer ball. Can you imagine that? One of his buddies, his pals, was Santiago Abreu, and apparently he was killed, I believe, near Santo Domingo in that area. And the story goes they cut his hands and feet off and dangled them in front of him. Some of these stories might be a little bit embellished. They say they might have cut off other parts of him. I don't know. I wasn't there. But nonetheless, beheadings was one of the ways of executing in New Mexico in weird history. Now we're jumping way into the American period, territorial period, New Mexico. Look at that fine, dapper gentleman, Thomas Edward Ketchum. Don't be fooled, he was an outlaw. And he was the victim of a botched hanging. He was born 1863 in Texas, but in 1901, April 26 at Clayton, New Mexico, Thomas Edward Ketchum, also known as Blackjack. All those outlaws had nicknames, Billy the Kid, Blackjack, Ketchum. He had a difficult childhood, apparently. They all do. And he was originally a farmer, both in Texas and in New Mexico. But by 1892, he started a life of crime. He was a train robber and a murderer. Well, all of this caught up with him in 1895 when he killed John Powers in Texas. He was captured in New Mexico and sentenced to hanging. Well, I don't know all the details about this sort of thing. It seems to me that for hangings, they just put a rope, a noose around a victim's neck, and then they kick the ground out from under them, and then they hang and die. But I guess there's a certain science to it, the weight of the person being hanged, the length of the rope, the distance between the floor and the solid ground underneath. Well, something went wrong, and this guy lost his head. There's a photo of Blackjack after his botched hanging. The man who lost his head, he was beheaded. His head was torn off, essentially, when the hanging took place. Gruesome, I know, but again, it's part of weird New Mexico history. El Hombre Sapo, the Toad Man of Mora. I was told stories by my father, Roberto Martinez. He was from Mora, and he used to tell us stories about brujas, hechiceras of Mora and Abiquiu, New Mexico. And he used to tell us about the Toad Man of Mora. Supposedly, this guy could turn into a toad. And this is a common idea where people have strong beliefs in brujeria, witchcraft, and hechiceria, sorcery. The idea that a person who practices these things can turn themselves into an animal. And this is something you find in Hispanic traditions, in native Pueblo, Navajo, Hopi traditions, this idea. So it's a universal concept. Well, apparently, the Toad Man of Mora was a man named Avelino Cedillo. He was accused of being a witch, a person who could turn himself into a toad or a frog. The sheriff in town was Arsenio Vigil, and the idea came out that people who were working with Avelino, they would notice that he would never go to sleep, and they'd look out for him, and he'd always be seen near the campfires blinking like a sapo, like a toad. So there was a lot of suspicion about this guy. What I find interesting is this is in the 20th century. The story makes the Santa Fe New Mexican, and the story reports that Avelino Cedillo, he's 48, who in just a few days has become famous as the Toad or Frogman, and upon whom, listen to this, a fine of $1,000 was placed for practicing witchcraft and mutilation. Well, Avelino denied these accusations, and I don't know if he ever had to pay the $1,000 or if he just disappeared. We don't know. But I always was fascinated by this weird story. When witches pose as curanderas, or folk healers. Brujas or curanderas? This is a common question. I'm always asked when I give talks about witchcraft history, about the role of curanderas in witchcraft lore and history. And the fact is, they're not one and the same, although sometimes a curandera could be confused for a witch, but we'll see sometimes witches can pose as curanderas. I have this picture of curanderas and parteras. These are the women who would help deliver babies. And sometimes they could also get tangled up in these stories. But these were very important women in the community, curanderas and parteras. Brujas, witches at Abiquiu, infamous case. I can't go into all the details, but there were two women involved. They were Genízara Indians. Genízaras were the non-Pueblo native peoples who were put in servitude, supposedly Hispanicized to a point, but nevertheless they also clung to their ancient Native American practices. So there was one woman named Atole Caliente, a hot gruel. Atole is a cornmeal. I've eaten that many times when I was a kid. But her name was Atole Caliente, and oftentimes these nicknames were attached to women who were usually Native American who were accused, and they're given these names probably attached to what they do or how they practice their sorcery. She was one, Petrona la Come Gallinas, Petrona who eats chickens She was another one. I don't know why that name seems kind of funny, but I like to think she did some horrible things to chickens, maybe while she was practicing her weird sorcery, so-called. These women at some point in the story at Abiquiu, this is in the 1760s, imagine that. This is before there was ever a United States. They supposedly posed as curanderas to cause more injury. If someone was ill with a hex or a curse, supposedly they would go in with food, usually with some cheese or maybe some bread that had been poisoned or bewitched, and they would cause even more harm. And they were very powerful in their community, and people were terrified of them. The possessions and exorcisms at Abiquiu. One of the nastier side effects of witchcraft practice, at least if you read the old books from the 1600s and 1700s, is demonic possession. A person supposedly could be possessed by evil spirit and have all kinds of strange and weird happenings take place around them. This happened at Abiquiu. The case at Abiquiu, the two women I mentioned, and about 10 other people, men and women, were accused of being hechiceros or sorcerers and brujos, witches. So the exorcisms at Abiquiu, let's look at this. Supposedly, according to the documents written by and reported by the priest, Fray Juan Jose Toledo, when he would have mass in the church at Abiquiu, the afflicted women supposedly fell to the floor and shook violently. This would be about 5 young maidens who were supposedly possessed. And then he wrote that when people went to help them, the women would howl loudly. They would scream and make grinding gestures. That's the term he used. I'm not sure what that means, if they were dancing or if they were making movements. I think the description in the document was they would make movements like they were grinding corn on a metate, a grinding stone, like the native peoples do in New Mexico, and the Hispanics. Supposedly, the young women, they shrieked like owls, foxes, pigs, cows, and other animals. In other words, they made animal noises in church during Mass. Sounds like there was a challenge to the priest's authority going on there, much like teachers have to deal with when they're dealing with unruly students in class. But this is a little more serious and a little more weird. The women appeared to levitate and fall quickly as bystanders attempted to hold them. And it also reports that they had difficulty moving them. They could lay on the ground, and very strong men couldn't move them or hold them down. So let's look at a case study. I've got a couple here we can look at. Look at Maria Trujillo. She was the wife of Juan Trujillo of Abiquiu. And her exorcism by the priest Toledo was in December of 1763. In June, she started to have fainting spells at certain points during exorcism prayers, and supposedly purple blemishes would appear on her shoulder, elbow, hand, and knee. In other words, her coloring would change. And this is an interesting point in the document. After giving birth to a child, she was afflicted in November with headaches, stomach pains, and look at this, extreme melancholy, heavy sleep at Mass. I don't know if that bodes well for Father Toledo. Maybe his sermons were boring. I don't know. But it certainly is strange. In December, she fainted and went into an extreme, a violent fit of fury, and exhausted herself with unnatural strength. I suppose the people who were there couldn't hold her down. By the way, these exorcisms were public. They were not held in the church, but outside of the church. Again, Father Toledo resorted to the spiritual remedy of exorcism on the 18th of December. Look at this case study number 2. Another young lady, Francisca Varela. She was poor and cloistered, 18 years old. When she went to get water, she said she felt some strange movement inside her and went home, but she heard an animal following her. It sounded like a pig, but she couldn't see anything. She just heard it. When inside the house, she began again grinding corn on the that then was seized by a tingling sensation. Sounds kind of like anxiety. She went for more water and again felt a presence with her. And when she finally came home, she fell into a violent seizure. When they took her to see the priest, she made ferocious noises, and it says that she made imponderable shouts and movements, and her eyes flicked violently up inside her head, and her coloring changed to gray. So this sounds kind of like what we see in some of the movies we have seen in the 70s about demonic possession and exorcism. But these documents are from the 1700s. Supposedly she tried to bite those people who held her down and mimicked again the sounds of animals like pigs, cows, owls. And when the priest prayed over her, he used a purple stole, cross, and holy water during the exorcism. This comes right out of the Manual of Exorcism that was in circulation in the 1700s. And even today, the Roman ritual says that a priest performing an exorcism needs to have a purple stole. That's for penance. It symbolizes penance, and holy water, and a crucifix. Supposedly, and according to the priest, she was violent, and it was difficult for 4 men to hold her down. And it says that she howled in a very loud voice. Listen to this. Like the Indians of this land are accustomed to. So I'm not sure what that means. That would tell me that maybe she wasn't an Indian, that maybe she was Hispanic, but still, it sounds like she had been exposed to the local culture of the Native American people of the region. Case study number 3 of exorcism at Abiquiu. Let's see. Maria Chavez, 12 years old. She began experiencing sharp pain on her side. She trembled and sobbed, shaking violently with strange movements. And listen to this. It was discovered that Indian bread makers ensorcelled or poisoned the bread that she ate. So there's something going on here that's spiritual but also physical, which is kind of what you're dealing with witchcraft and sorcery. Witchcraft tends to lead more towards the spiritual, sorcery more towards physical actions, but they tend to get mixed up in New Mexico in the 1700s. The accused Indian was Jacinta, and pay attention, she's the daughter of Atole Caliente, believed to be a great sorcerer, the woman I mentioned earlier. So Maria confessed and accused Jacinta of bewitching her. Maria was taken to the church to go to Mass and receive the exorcism along with the other afflicted women. So these exorcisms at Abiquiu, what came out of them besides the heightened anxiety and excitement and fear that would fill a community going through these things? Well, during these exorcisms, supposedly the invading spirits accused 178 people of witchcraft in New Mexico and down into Sonora. Eventually, the so-called invading spirits were calmed. And there's a famous image from The Exorcist, a weird movie about an actual case of possession and exorcism in St. Louis, Missouri in 1949. So remember this. New Mexico history is fun, it's fascinating and enriching, it's mind-expanding, sometimes even mind-blowing, but it's sometimes weird. Weird New Mexico history. So there you go. I'm from the Office of the State Historian of New Mexico. I'm State Historian Robert Martinez. There's my phone number, the office in Santa Fe. If you want to call me and ask questions or talk history, give me a call. There's my email address, and please visit our website. It's www.newmexicohistory.org. Thank you for joining me for Weird New Mexico History. See you later. Hasta pronto.